3 years after I ended the one relationship I had never completely made peace with, I opened the door to a lighthouse in Rhode Island and found the man I'd left standing over a map with my name written in the corner. I stopped so abruptly that the heavy service room door nearly swung back into me. Julian Cross looked up from the table. 3 years had changed enough to make the moment stranger, not easier. His medium brown hair was shorter at the sides now, swept neatly back, and the olive field overshirt over his off-white Henley made him look broader than I remembered. But those gray-blue eyes were unmistakable. Cameron. My name sounded almost ordinary in his voice. Julian. I tightened my grip on the folder under my arm. I had come to the historic lighthouse complex on Narragansett Bay expecting a routine preservation assignment lasting several weeks. My job was to inspect areas affected by salt exposure, document preservation needs, and coordinate access for the work that would follow. Nobody had mentioned that the coastal mapping specialist assigned to the project was my ex-boyfriend. Julian glanced at the paperwork spread across the table. I saw C. Hale on the access notes. I didn't realize it was you. I followed his gaze and found my name handwritten beside a list of exterior inspection points. So there was no setup, no secret decision that had brought us together. Just an initial and a coincidence neither of us had recognized in time. I didn't know it would be you either, I said. Julian gave a small nod. But we're here to do a job. It was not cold. Somehow that made it harder. I had imagined this reunion more times than I wanted to admit, and Julian had been angry in some versions, wounded in others. In none of them had he simply returned his attention to a coastal survey and asked me which exterior route I intended to use. I opened my preservation plans and pointed to the eastern access path. Julian immediately shook his head. Not with equipment. He pulled an updated survey toward me and indicated a narrow section beside the lighthouse. The shoreline has shifted enough that the older access information isn't reliable there. There's been erosion along this edge. We should walk it before you plan around it. That changed my morning in less than a minute. More importantly, it made avoiding Julian impossible. Outside, late September air came hard off Narragansett Bay as we followed the perimeter. I wore my navy work jacket over a light gray crewneck shirt, dark work pants, and brown leather boots. Julian moved several feet ahead of me in rugged waterproof boots, checking his survey against the ground. Within minutes, something unsettling happened. We worked well together. Julian identified the areas where the land had changed. I evaluated what those changes meant for safe preservation access. There was no dramatic confrontation, only the disturbing ease of two people who still understood how the other thought. Near the shoreline, I finally said, I really didn't know you'd be here. Julian looked at me. For a second, I saw the man I had loved. Then he glanced toward the lighthouse. Neither did I. He adjusted the rolled survey in his hand. Come on. There's another section you need to see. And he walked ahead. I followed with the old preservation plans tucked beneath my arm, watching Julian move toward a coastline those plans no longer described accurately. I had arrived believing the difficult part would be discovering what 3 years had done to him. Following him toward the water, I began to wonder what those 3 years had done to me. By the second morning, Julian and I had settled into a rhythm I had not expected to recover so quickly. We were not pretending the past had disappeared, but neither of us was using it as an excuse to make the project harder. I inspected the lighthouse structure while Julian updated his shoreline measurements, and whenever our work overlapped, we compared notes at the long table in the service room. It should have felt awkward. Instead, it felt efficient. That bothered me more than awkwardness would have. At one point, Julian leaned over a survey and went completely quiet, his attention narrowing until the rest of the room seemed irrelevant. I remembered that silence. 3 years earlier, I had learned not to interrupt it unless something was important. A few minutes later, I caught him looking at the pencil in my hand. I was tapping it against my thumb without realizing it. You still do that, he said. I stopped. Apparently. A faint smile crossed his face before he returned to the map. Neither of us explained what he meant. We did not need to. Later that morning, we carried the current survey and an older site map outside to compare several reference points along the shoreline. The differences were larger than I had expected. A section that looked comfortably removed from the water on the older map now sat much closer to the edge of the usable ground. I studied both versions. So the old map was wrong? Julian shook his head. No. It was accurate when they made it. He crouched to check a reference point, then stood again. The coastline changed. That does not make the old survey false. It just means you cannot use it as if nothing happened afterward. He was talking about coastal mapping, nothing more. Still, the sentence followed me back to the lighthouse. Around noon, we ate outside where we could see the harbor in the distance. For several minutes, we talked only about the project schedule. Then I asked, "Did you know you were coming to Newport when you accepted this assignment?" Julian gave me a puzzled look. "Of course. That is not what I meant." He waited. I should have left it there, but curiosity won. "If you had known I was the preservation technician, would you still have taken it?" Julian considered the question seriously. "Probably." I looked at him. "Probably. I might have wondered whether working together would be uncomfortable." He took another sip of coffee. "But yes, Cameron, I probably would have come." I had expected relief. Instead, something tightened inside me. "That easy." Julian's expression changed slightly. Not anger. Recognition. "It was not easy 3 years ago." His voice remained calm. "But I stopped arranging my life around avoiding you a long time ago." There was nothing cruel in the words, which made them impossible to dismiss as resentment. Julian gathered the empty containers and stood. "We should check the north side before the afternoon tide gets higher." I watched him head toward the lighthouse, realizing I had entered this project wondering whether seeing me would reopen something in Julian. I had been measuring the reunion by what I imagined he might still carry. But Julian had just shown me that he had learned how to move through a world where I might appear without allowing my presence to determine his direction. As I followed him back toward work, a more uncomfortable question took the place of the one he had answered. If Julian was no longer organizing his life around what happened between us, why was I still interpreting every moment with him through something I had chosen to end 3 years ago? Over the next several days, working beside Julian became comfortable enough that avoiding our history started to feel more deliberate than discussing it. The opening came late one afternoon while we were reviewing access notes in the lighthouse service room. Julian mentioned that his current assignments were shorter than the projects he used to take, and I looked up. "You changed your schedule?" He nodded. "A while ago. I still travel, but I have more control over which projects I accept and how long I stay." 3 years earlier, that answer would have changed everything. Back then, Julian could leave for a mapping assignment for weeks or months and rarely knew what came after it. I had wanted plans we could make together. He had wanted me to accept that sometimes he simply could not tell me where he would be 6 months later. Neither of us had been dishonest. Neither of us had betrayed the other. Eventually, I became tired of feeling as though our future depended on the next contract Julian had not received yet. I was the one who finally ended it. "You were thinking about it," Julian said. "About what?" "Whether this would have made a difference back then." There was no point denying it. "Would it?" Julian leaned against the table. "Maybe, but I was not this person back then." His answer stopped me from turning his changed career into an easy correction of our past. That evening, after we finished documenting the day's work, we stepped outside into the cool September air. I should have gone back to my place in Newport. Instead, I stayed beside him near the lighthouse, looking across Narragansett Bay. "Do you ever think we ended too soon?" I asked. Julian was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes I used to." The words pulled my attention toward him. "Used to?" "After you ended things, I kept thinking you might call." His expression remained steady, but the honesty in his voice made the distance between then and now suddenly feel much smaller. For months, every time my phone rang at the right time of night, part of me wondered if it was you. I had spent 3 years assuming Julian had accepted the breakup more easily because he had not tried to change my mind. Hearing otherwise hurt in a different way. I did not know that. "You were not supposed to." We had broken up. I looked toward the water. "I loved you, Julian." "I know. And you still let me leave." He turned toward me fully. "What did you want me to do? Promise you a life I could not honestly promise?" I had no answer. Julian continued, quieter now. "We already know we could love each other. That was never the problem." I met his eyes. "Did you still love me after I left?" "Yes." He did not hesitate. "For a long time." The answer gave me something I had once desperately wanted to know, but it did not give me the conclusion I expected. Julian looked back toward the lighthouse. "Missing you did not make us compatible." For years, part of me had wanted that answer. Now that I finally had it, nothing became simpler. Julian had loved me after I left, and somehow that made the past harder to dismiss but impossible to romanticize. I looked at the man beside me and realized I had been asking whether we should have stayed together. The harder question was what would actually have to be different if we ever tried again. For the next few days, Julian and I stopped treating every conversation as if it might accidentally lead back to our breakup. We had already said what happened, and strangely, that made ordinary moments possible again. One afternoon, Julian found me studying a revised access plan and pointed at a route I had marked. "You finally stopped trying to make the east side work." I looked at him. "I respond well to overwhelming evidence. That is not how I remember you." I laughed before I could stop myself, and Julian laughed too. It was the first time since our reunion that neither of us seemed to measure the sound against what we used to be. Later, while we checked measurements outside, Julian told me he had changed more than his work schedule. "I used to think having no permanent plan meant I was free," he said. "Every new assignment felt like another option. And now, eventually, I realized options are not the same thing as direction." I understood the difference in him then. 3 years ago, asking Julian where he wanted to be next year had made him restless. Now he could admit that he wanted a home base, even if his work still took him elsewhere. When we returned to the service room, he asked what had changed for me. I told him about preservation projects I had completed and responsibilities I had taken on. Julian listened, then shook his head. "That is your resume. I asked about you." I leaned back against the table. The honest answer was less flattering. "I dated after you." Julian waited without reacting. Nothing serious lasted. "Why?" I thought I was being careful. Saying it aloud made the explanation sound weaker. Whenever something started becoming serious, I found reasons it probably would not work. Different schedules, different plans, sometimes nothing specific at all. Julian's expression softened, but he did not rescue me from what I was realizing. I had spent years telling myself that our breakup taught me to recognize incompatibility early. Maybe it had, but somewhere along the way, caution had become a convenient name for leaving before anyone could make my future uncertain. That realization followed me into the evening. We finished later than usual, after the sunlight had faded across Narragansett Bay. Outside, the stone near the lighthouse was damp from the coastal air. I stepped around a slick patch and my boot shifted slightly. Julian reached out instinctively, catching my forearm while I caught his. I was steady again almost immediately, but neither of us let go at once. His gray-blue eyes met mine. There was no confusion in his expression, and none in mine. The moment lasted only a few seconds before we released each other, but something had changed. This was not simply the comfort of remembering how we used to fit together. I had spent the day discovering things about Julian I had never known because they belonged to the man he had become after me. And Julian had just seen something about me I had barely understood myself. As we walked toward the parking area, I realized the question was no longer whether our old feelings had survived. I needed to know whether what I felt now belonged to the man walking beside me, or to the memory of the man I had once loved. The question followed me into the next day, and by late afternoon I decided I was tired of answering it only inside my own head. While Julian packed his survey equipment in the lighthouse service room, I asked, "Do you want to have dinner with me tonight?" He looked up. "Dinner? Away from here. No project notes. No shoreline measurements." Julian studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right." We chose a small restaurant near the Newport waterfront, somewhere neither of us had visited when we were together. That mattered to me more than I expected. Without work between us, the evening felt less like two former boyfriends revisiting familiar territory and more like two men discovering how much conversation could change in 3 years. Julian told me about places his mapping work had taken him, but what interested me most was how differently he spoke about them now. He no longer described movement as an end in itself. He talked about wanting somewhere to return to. I found myself telling him things I had never told anyone I dated after him, including how often I had mistaken emotional distance for good judgment. Eventually our plates were cleared, and I knew I had reached the reason I had invited him. "I keep thinking about what you said," I told him, "about us loving each other not being the problem." Julian waited. "Maybe we deserve another chance." His answer came quietly. "No." I had prepared myself for uncertainty. I had not prepared for that. "No, not like that." Julian rested his hands on the table. "Cameron, the man you dated, 3 years ago took assignments without knowing where he would be next, avoided making plans because plans felt like restrictions, and expected you to be comfortable with that. I am not that man anymore. I know. And you are not the same man either. I started to answer, but Julian continued. That is exactly why I do not want another chance. The disappointment on my face must have been obvious because his expression softened. You are talking about reopening something we already closed. I do not want to spend the next month trying to reconstruct a relationship that belonged to two people who do not exist anymore. I looked down at the table, then back at him. So what are you saying? Julian considered me for a second. If we had met for the first time this month, would you want me? The question should have been easy. I was attracted to him. I liked working beside him. I looked forward to hearing his voice before I entered the lighthouse each morning. But every feeling I had was tangled with memories of Sunday breakfasts, airport goodbyes, arguments about schedules, and the life I once imagined we might build. Julian saw my hesitation. He did not look offended. That is what I mean. I do not know how to separate who you are from who you were to me. Maybe you should figure that out before asking for us back. There was no accusation in his voice. That made the truth harder to avoid. When we left the restaurant, Julian did not ask me to walk with him, and I did not manufacture a reason to prolong the evening. We said goodnight on the sidewalk and went in opposite directions. For 3 years, I had occasionally wondered whether ending our relationship had been a mistake. Now Julian had forced me to see that I had been asking the wrong question. I did not need to decide whether the past deserved another chance. I needed to decide whether, if all our history disappeared tomorrow, I would still choose the man Julian had become. The next morning, I decided that if Julian wanted me to stop treating him like a memory, I had to learn who he was without using our history as a shortcut. We were reviewing survey notes in the lighthouse service room when I set down my pencil and asked, "What do you want your life to look like 5 years from now?" Julian glanced up. That is different. Different from what? Yesterday you wanted another chance. Today you sound like you are meeting me for the first time. Maybe I am trying to. A smile touched his face. All right. 5 years from now, I want a home base. Somewhere I can leave for a project and actually come back to. I still want field work, just not a life where every assignment decides what happens next. The answer mattered because it was not something Julian would have said 3 years ago. More importantly, I realized I liked hearing it from the man sitting across from me now, not because it repaired something he had once failed to give me. Julian turned the question around. I told him I wanted to manage larger preservation projects someday. Then why are you not doing that already? He asked. I hesitated. I have had opportunities. And I kept finding reasons not to take them. Saying it aloud exposed the pattern immediately. Bigger projects meant longer commitments, more responsibility, and fewer easy exits. Julian did not point out the irony. He did not need to. Over the following days, the difference showed up in smaller ways. Julian began marking future survey dates around Newport, instead of talking about whatever assignment might come next. I caught myself volunteering for follow-up preservation work I once would have avoided because it tied me to a longer schedule. Neither change was dramatic, but working beside him made something increasingly difficult to ignore. We were no longer describing different futures. We were both learning how to stay connected to a life without giving up the parts of ourselves that still needed room to move. One evening, after finishing our work, we climbed to the lighthouse observation deck. The late September air was cool, and Narragansett Bay stretched beyond us under the fading light. Julian rested his forearms against the railing. I have an answer of my own to what we talked about at dinner, he said. About what? Whether this is about who we were. I waited. Julian turned toward me. I am attracted to you, Cameron. Not the version of you from 3 years ago. You now. The directness left me smiling before I could hide it. Good. Good. Because I think I am falling for you twice. And somehow the second time feels nothing like the first. Julian laughed softly, then became quiet. We were standing close enough that I knew a kiss would have been easy. For a moment, I thought he might close the distance. Instead, Julian said, I want to wait. I understood immediately that he was not rejecting me. Okay. If we do this, I do not want the next thing between us to happen because it is familiar. Then it will not. Something in his expression relaxed. We stayed there a little longer, shoulder to shoulder, without needing to turn restraint into disappointment. By the time we walked down from the lighthouse, one question had finally been answered. I was not trying to recover the man I had lost 3 years ago, and Julian was not trying to recover me. Whatever was forming between us belonged to the present. The harder question was whether I could let it become a future without first demanding to know exactly what that future would look like. The question I had carried down from the observation deck stopped being theoretical 2 days later. I was reviewing preservation notes in the service room when my project supervisor called. He told me the organization was expanding coordination across several historic coastal sites in Rhode Island and asked whether I would consider taking a longer-term role overseeing preservation work in the region. It was exactly the kind of opportunity one had claimed to want for years. It was also the kind I had repeatedly avoided because accepting it meant committing to responsibilities I could not casually walk away from when circumstances changed. I asked for until the next morning to answer. After the call, Julian noticed my expression. Good news. Possibly. I told him about the position. That sounds like what you said you wanted. It is. Julian did not tell me to accept it. He simply nodded and returned to his work, leaving the decision where it belonged. Later that afternoon, while we compared the final survey updates, Julian mentioned that his next mapping assignment had been confirmed. I leave after we finish here, he said. How long? Several weeks. The word should not have surprised me. Julian had never said he was giving up fieldwork. In fact, he had been clear that he did not want to. Still, I felt an old reaction rise before I could reason with it. 3 years disappeared for a moment, and I remembered waiting for schedules, calculating distances, wondering when uncertainty would finally become too much. The easiest response presented itself immediately. Stop this now, before Julian left, before whatever was growing between us became something I could lose. I became quieter as we finished the day's work. Julian noticed, but he did not chase me through the silence. When we stepped outside, he finally said, "You have been somewhere else since I told you about the assignment." I looked toward Narragansett Bay. I am trying not to make the same mistake twice. Which mistake? That question exposed the problem. I had been assuming I already knew. Starting something when I do not know whether it can work. Julian was quiet for a moment. If you decide you do not want this, I will believe you. I looked at him. His expression was calm, but there was a boundary in it I had not seen 3 years ago. But do not tell yourself you are protecting both of us when you are really making the decision for me. He did not ask me to promise anything. He did not offer to cancel his assignment. He simply went back inside to finish packing his equipment for the day. I remained outside with the old preservation plans and Julian's updated coastal map spread on a work surface beside me. The two versions showed the same place, but the lines did not match. Suddenly, the pattern in my own life became embarrassingly clear. Julian had once been the person afraid to commit to a direction. Somewhere after losing him, I had become the person who needed every exit preserved. I had called it caution because that sounded wiser than fear. The old relationship had taught me something real, but I had been applying that lesson to circumstances that no longer existed. The next morning now held two decisions that were connected in a way I could no longer ignore. I had to tell my supervisor whether I would commit to the preservation role, and I had to decide whether loving Julian required certainty about where we would end up, or simply enough courage to begin without it. By the time Julian arrived at the lighthouse the next morning, I had already made the first decision. We met in the service room for our final project review, with completed preservation notes stacked beside his updated coastal survey. I did not wait for another perfect moment. I accepted the regional position. Julian looked at me, then smiled. Congratulations. Thank you. But there is something else. His smile faded into attentive silence. For 3 years, I thought what happened between us taught me to be careful about commitment. Yesterday, I realized I learned the wrong lesson. Julian did not interrupt. I started treating every uncertain future like a warning. If I could always leave, I could never be trapped in the wrong life. I called that freedom. I looked back at Julian. It was mostly fear with better vocabulary. Julian's expression softened. Cameron, I am not asking you to stop traveling. I am not asking where you will be every month next year. And I am not asking you to promise this will work. I stepped closer to the table. I just know I do not want uncertainty to make this decision for me. For the first time that morning, Julian looked genuinely surprised. So what are you asking? I smiled. Go on a date with me. He stared at me for a second. We have been on more dates than I can count. Not this version of us. I shook my head. Not our 100th date. Our first. The smile that spread across Julian's face answered before he did. Yes. Something inside me became quiet. There was no dramatic certainty about the rest of our lives, only a clear decision about what I wanted now. Julian stepped closer. There is one more thing. What? I believe a first date should eventually come with a first kiss. I laughed. Eventually? I have been trying to be responsible. You have been extremely responsible. This time neither of us had a reason to wait. Julian leaned toward me, and I met him halfway. The kiss was gentle and brief, but it felt more significant than trying to recreate anything we had shared before. When we separated, Julian rested his hand lightly against my arm and smiled. That was new. Good. We finished the project review without pretending the conversation had solved every practical question. Before we left, Julian told me something he had already decided independently. After his upcoming field assignment, he planned to make Newport his professional home base for the foreseeable future. Because of me? I asked. No. His answer came immediately, and I was relieved by it. I started arranging that before you walked through that door. I want somewhere to come back to. Newport works for the kind of projects I want to take. And you are still leaving for several weeks. Yes. 3 years ago, that answer would have sounded like a threat to everything I wanted. Now it sounded like information two people could build around. Outside, the early October wind moved across Narragansett Bay as we walked beside the lighthouse. Julian was still leaving. I had just committed myself to work that would keep me rooted here. Neither of us had sacrificed a career to make the other comfortable. We had not solved the future. We had simply stopped requiring it to be solved before allowing ourselves to have one. When Julian reached for my hand, I took it without wondering how long I would be able to hold on. For once, knowing where we were starting felt like enough. Julian left Newport 2 days after our first date. 3 years earlier, watching him leave for another assignment would have filled me with questions I could not answer. This time, we did something surprisingly ordinary. We talked about when his workday allowed it. We exchanged messages when something made us laugh. I sent him a photograph when the first phase of work began at another historic coastal site under my new regional responsibilities, and he sent me a photograph of a map covered with so many field notes that I told him it looked like an argument between 3 cartographers. Distance was still inconvenient. It simply was not a verdict. Several weeks later, Julian returned to Newport on a clear October afternoon. We had dinner that evening, and when he appeared outside the restaurant, I realized how different missing someone felt when I was not treating absence as evidence that the relationship was failing. Julian smiled when he saw me, crossed the sidewalk, and wrapped his arms around me. I held him close. "Welcome home," I said. He pulled back just enough to look at me. I liked the sound of that. A few days later, he asked me to meet him at the lighthouse after work. The preservation project there was moving into its next phase, and returning felt strangely appropriate. Julian was waiting outside in his olive overshirt with a narrow roll of mapping paper in one hand. "I brought you something. Should I be worried?" "Probably not." He handed me the roll. I opened it carefully. Most of the sheet was blank. I turned it over, thinking I had missed something. "Julian, there is almost nothing on this." Almost. Near the center was a single marked point with the lighthouse coordinates printed beneath it, numbers I had seen repeatedly in our survey documents. I recognized them after a moment. The lighthouse. Exactly. I looked at the empty space surrounding it. What kind of map has only a starting point? Julian smiled. One we have not made yet. For a few seconds, I simply looked at all that empty space. Then I took the pencil Julian offered and added a small point a short distance from the lighthouse mark. "What is that?" he asked. "Dinner tonight." Very ambitious future planning. I am growing. Julian laughed, took the pencil, and placed another point beyond mine. "And that? You will find out after dinner." That sounds suspiciously like uncertainty. "Think you can handle it?" I rolled the map carefully beneath one arm and took his hand. "I am learning." We stood beside the lighthouse with Narragansett Bay stretching beyond us, the October air cool against my face. Julian leaned closer, and I kissed him. It was not the tentative first kiss from weeks earlier. This one carried the warmth of being missed, welcomed home, and chosen again after distance had been allowed to remain only distance. When we separated, his forehead rested briefly against mine. Then we started toward the harbor, hand in hand. Behind us stood a lighthouse built to endure years of changing weather. Ahead of us lay a coastline that would never stop changing. Neither seemed like a contradiction anymore. Sometimes an ending does not mean that what came before was wrong. A relationship can be real, loving, and meaningful, yet still belong to a particular version of two people at a particular moment in their lives. Perhaps one of the harder things about love is accepting that the past can deserve tenderness without being allowed to dictate the future. There are also times when certainty feels like safety, especially after something important has ended. But certainty and courage are not always the same thing. Maybe moving forward is less about knowing exactly where something will lead and more about seeing the person in front of us clearly enough to make an honest choice in the present. Cameron and Julian did not erase what happened between them. They allowed it to remain true without asking it to remain permanent. If you had been in Cameron's position, how would you decide whether returning to someone from your past meant repeating an old relationship or beginning something genuinely new? What part of their choice would have been hardest for you to make?